Hello, people of environmental rhetoric. I thought it would be useful for me to talk a little bit about Schiappa because in the last couple of weeks, we've been dealing specifically with definitions. And in different kinds of ways, I think some of you probably want to pick up on the ways in which Schiappa uses definitions in order to make arguments about rhetoric. And I think you want to apply them in your own ways. Remember, the purpose of this paper is really to pick a theorist and pick an approach to rhetoric, and then go looking for different kinds of texts where you could apply that theory to that text. We've been calling it a test object. You can call it an artifact. Really, what we're talking about are news articles or opinion pieces or arguments or TED Talks. Like I've said before, the world of rhetoric is very large. And so any place you see someone making an argument about an environmental issue in any way you can imagine could be useful. In this video, then, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us into Schiappa very quickly to show us three different moments in Schiappa that might be good to highlight in your papers as a way of saying, here is me understanding his theory of definitions before you start to apply the theory of definitions in your own way. So I'm going to share my screen as I do. Here we are. When are definitions political? Always the case of wetlands. I am just going to go to 3 pages in this particularly long reading to show you different kinds of ways of approaching this as a theory. So the first thing I would note, surprisingly, is the first page. Look where he says, my argument is that all definitions are political, specifically in 2 respects. First, definitions always serve particular interests. Second, the only definitions of consequence are those that have been empowered through persuasion or coercion. That is a fascinating way to begin. On the first hand, definitions serve particular interests. We are focused on what a definition would do downstream. Once you've established a definition, let's say you're a scientist and you've attracted the world's attention, right? Because you're suddenly saying helium is a gas and not a molecule or something like that. Your interests are being served by establishing that definition. That definition becoming the way that we look at helium is good for you, good for other scientists in your particular field. It's good maybe for knowledge, right? And you are a scientist. You care about knowledge and about the generation of new knowledge about the way that the universe works, right? But the second part of it, the only definitions of consequence are those that have been empowered through persuasion or coercion, focuses us on the things that happen before the definition is famous, right? You're a scientist, you're studying butterflies on the side of a mountain in the Rocky Mountains, right? But you're laboring in obscurity. Nobody knows about your research, and maybe you wrote something down, but how does anybody hear it? This is the problem of climate change through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, is not just that climate change wasn't a popular topic to talk about. There were plenty of scientists who were talking about climate change on a regular basis, publishing studies, thousands, tens of thousands of studies about climate change. But where did they go? What did they do? How did they make it into the media? Well, to some of us, they didn't make it into the media. We didn't talk about it enough. Us people who were non-scientists didn't know enough from scientists. And, you know, there's another argument that maybe scientists didn't work hard enough to be public advocates for the science they were doing. We all are to blame to a certain extent. The major issue is that, well, huge oil companies like Exxon conspired in order to keep scientific knowledge from the public. All of this returns us to this major point right here. The only definitions of consequence are those that have been empowered through persuasion or coercion. So what does this mean in terms of our papers? Well, you could look at how a definition gets established in the first place through rhetoric, or you could look at the consequences of that definition being established. That is, what happens once we all decide Pluto is no longer a planet? We've defined planet as things that, do things that are not Pluto. So what are we talking about here? You have different ways of doing this paper. One would be to approach the paper and find a text that tries to establish a definition. Another way would be to find a text that shows that definition doing some work. And of course, both of these things are rhetorical. Schiappa goes on, obviously not all definitions are equally important. We all have different interests, right? Some definitions involve life and death decisions, and others are trivial, and most fall someplace in between. He's getting a little, he's saying, I think, a truism, right? There will be immediate implications for some definitions. Let's say we decide that life ends at 60 and you can't be over 60. That's a weird definition of a human life, but it would have immediate effects on all of us. Others are trivial. Most fall someplace in between. I don't know if any definition is trivial. Why would we engage in it if it were totally trivial? But it would be a mistake to think that inaction or trivial actions that leave the status quo unchallenged are politically irrelevant. If we look hard enough, all definitions serve some sort of interests, even if those interests are as simple as coordinating our linguistic behavior so we know how and when to use a word in a socially acceptable manner. Again, Pluto. Maybe it's not a big deal to the people of the United States or of the world that Pluto seems to astrophysicists no longer to be a planet. It was demoted, right? But how does it coordinate linguistic behavior? Every book that mentions the solar system has to change downstream. So a trivial change, perhaps, but it's a change to all of the textbooks of the world if they want to be current and if they want to say a socially acceptable thing. To the extent that we listen to astrophysicists about Pluto, then we're going to have to change those textbooks. And that's going to cost money. I mean, seriously, it's going to be some work and it's going to be some money. Defining what is or is not part of our shared reality is a profoundly political act. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And in terms of your paper, methodologically, concentrate on the time before a definition is established, find a text that's trying to establish a definition, or find a text that shows in different kinds of ways work to change things after that definition has been established. I'm going to go quickly to page 82, which seemed pretty important too. Here is a really cool area where he takes on the notion that why don't we just, leave all of the decisions to scientists? Plato's idea 2,500 years ago was the philosopher kings should rule. They're the smartest, right? But smart does not mean morally good. And there's been plenty of smart people who are just downright evil, or, maybe just not invested in human goodness or human flourishing, right? He goes on to say even further than that, rather than relegating the task of defining reality to philosopher kings, it's more productive and ethical to see definitional disputes as a matter of competing interests. I don't think he's being a total relativist here, but he's getting really close, while insisting that some interests are better than others. Okay, so if there is a scientific concern in the world, we certainly want to put scientific interests before, let's say, political interests. If there is a scientific issue that's on the table or a scientific definition, then we should look to scientists and their interests in order to organize how we might respond. But there could be other interests at play. And in some kinds of questions, political questions, public questions, community questions, it may be that the scientific approach or the scientific definition is indeed not the most important one. Science, for example, cannot really define beauty for a community, or truth for a community, or goodness, or love. That is one approach, but there are many. Accordingly, the questions to ask are, whose interests are being served by a particular definition, and do we want to identify with those interests? These are central rhetorical questions for us, right? Because if the goal of rhetoric is persuasion with the goal of identification, right? We could even reverse those. Identification with the goal of persuasion. Then it seems critical that we understand whose interests are being served. If you find a text has a definition in it, it's defining what it means to be human. It's defining what helium is. It's defining a new mole rat that exists in the Sahara as a particular genus or species of rat. Whose interests are being served by this particular definition is another way of talking about audience, right? Different audiences will read a text in different ways, and we need to understand, okay, so ideologically, who is prepared to read this definition, to understand it, to make it legible, right? Who's prepared to act on it, and who ultimately, and this is the ideological question, whose interests will be served, who benefits, and for whom might this be a challenge, right? That's the interpretive move where you can say, okay, here is the work that this definition does. Do we want to identify with these interests? Maybe some audiences do, and maybe other audiences don't. Okay, so good stuff. In the case of wetlands, he says the competing interests are fairly easy to identify in the contrast. The manual took the definition of wetlands and expanded it, and developers, timber companies, and highway departments wanted to shrink the definition of wetlands, to put fewer things inside of that definition. Okay, the final thing that I would point out, this final page on 88, this is me in perusal, by the way, so that's very cool. Power to define is power to influence behavior, right? Once you have a bully pulpit, it's sometimes called, once you have been platformed, to put it in the parlance of the logic of cancel culture and other kinds of like social media weirdness, power to define is power to influence behavior. The bigger the pulpit, the bigger the megaphone you have to encourage people to believe the way that you believe, the better a chance you have to influence behavior. All proposed definitions are devised for specific purposes that can be evaluated according to the interests that they advance. The success of any definition depends on how effectively its advocates persuade or coerce. Coercion is persuasion plus power, right? Parents have this coercive effect on their children. I know because I exert it on my children. I'm like, go to bed. You must go to bed. And they're like, okay. The success of any definition depends on how effectively its advocates persuade or coerce members of a given community to conform and use the term properly. So that is the work of rhetoric, to say this is a proper definition and others are not. In the case of wetlands, the Bush administration was unable to persuade enough regulators and citizens to support the proposed redefinition, that is to try to shrink the definition of wetlands to only wet, and was unwilling to coerce them to do so. Such disputes over the scope of government regulation highlight the political dimensions of defining that I believe is ubiquitous. Okay, so in terms of then your papers, I'm hoping that these 3 areas of Schiappa will help clarify how you would approach. You know what I would do? Step 1, I'd say, okay, I'm looking for a definition. Step 2, I'd say to myself, what are the environmental issues that I'm interested in? Step 3, I would pick one. Step 4, I would Google all kinds of terms related to that environmental issue to find people taking a stand on that particular environmental issue. Step five, I try to find one that used the definition. A little bunch of steps here. Step 6. Here's where it gets interesting. This is a 6. Here's my other hand. Step 6. I would learn as much as I could about the history of that particular definition and the role that it's played in the environmental issue generally. I'd try to find some information about how that definition came into being, how popular that definition is, so that I could start to figure out what work that definition has done. And step 7, I would choose to write my paper either on the before times or the after times. The before, how that definition came to be the most popular or proper definition of that particular environmental issue, or the work after that definition had been established that the term did on us. That is the work the definition did once it was established by scientists or other groups. Your text can help us learn about the use of this definition in an environmental debate. And you know, there's all kinds of things that we could talk about. In the articles that you read, terms like thermoregulation or evapotranspiration were interesting because they were terms that maybe needed more argument to be established, or maybe didn't need so much argument to be established. Redlining was the term that you all discovered was used in both. They were defined differently, but it's also a term that I think a lot of people don't know. I think there's all kinds of ways in which redlining captures the relationship between racism and environmentalism. That is the long history of designating certain areas for white people and against people of color. That is, has led to all kinds of environmental abuses. And just the idea that young children in urban areas have asthma at 3 times the rate of kids who live in suburban areas should give us pause, right? But as rhetoricians, what do? We look for uses of that term redlining and we think, well, how pervasive is this sense that redlining is the way that we look at these issues? Is redlining now an established definition that does certain kinds of work? Let's try to find an article that would illustrate that for us. You can do this on your own. You know, there's sustainable manufacturing majors in this class, and there are engineers in this class. There are interdisciplinary scholars in this class. You all can find different kinds of approaches, but start with your own interests, write from your own experience, find a text that then helps you understand definitions and the role that they play in environmental communication. Okay, I will stop. This is the world's longest video.